My parents gave my inheritance to my brother. The day my father died, I found out he had changed his will 3 weeks before the funeral and left me nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, not a single dollar, not the house I grew up in, not even the jewelry my grandmother had promised me with her own hands, and the worst part was my brother was standing right there in that lawyer's office smiling like he had known the whole time, because he had. My name is Claire, and I am going to tell you something that took me 4 years to be able to say out loud without my voice breaking. I grew up in a house that looked beautiful from the outside. A 2-story colonial in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, with a big maple tree in the front yard that turned orange every October, and a porch my mother would decorate for every season like she was auditioning to be on the cover of a magazine. From the outside we looked like a family. And for a long time I believed we were. My father Gerald was an engineer who built a small but profitable commercial real estate business over 30 years of hard, steady work. He was not a warm man. He was not the kind of father who came to your dance recitals or helped you study for your SATs, but he was there every single morning at that kitchen table, with his coffee and his newspaper, and that felt like something. It felt like enough. My mother Patricia was the kind of woman who ran every church bake sale and every neighborhood committee and volunteered at the hospital gift shop every Tuesday and somehow still had dinner on the table every night at 6. She was generous to everyone outside that house. Inside it was a different story. And then there was my brother Daniel. Daniel was 4 years younger than me, and from the moment he arrived he became the entire sun that our family orbited around. I want to be fair to the truth here. I am not going to sit here and tell you Daniel was evil. He was not. He was just a person who was never once told no, and what that does to a human being is a quiet kind of ruin. Every report card where he barely passed was met with my mother saying he just has so much energy, he is not meant to sit still. Every job he quit was met with my father saying that company did not deserve him. Every girlfriend he burned through was met with, well, she was not right for him anyway. And every one of my accomplishments, from graduating top of my class to getting my nursing degree to working double shifts for years to pay off my student loans without asking them for a single dollar, was met with a nod and a quick "that is nice, honey," and then the conversation turned back to Daniel. I told myself it did not bother me. I was lying to myself. I want you to understand what the next 10 years of my life looked like, because it matters for everything that comes after. I became a registered nurse at 23. I worked night shifts at a hospital in Columbus for the first 3 years because the night differential paid better, and I needed every penny I could get. I ate a lot of canned soup. I drove a car with 200,000 miles on it. I wore the same 4 pairs of shoes until the soles wore thin. But I was building something. I paid off every student loan. By the time I was 28, I got my certification in critical care nursing. I took on a second job teaching CPR classes on weekends, not because I had to, but because I was saving with a purpose. I wanted to buy a house. I wanted to own something. I wanted to have a floor underneath me that no one could pull away. When I was 31, I bought a small house on the east side of Columbus. Nothing fancy, 2 bedrooms, a little backyard, a kitchen. I painted yellow. I remember sitting on the floor of that empty house the night I got the keys, just sitting there in the quiet and thinking, I did this, I built this with my own hands. My parents came to see it once. My mother said the neighborhood looks a little rough, and my father asked if I had made sure the furnace was up to code. Daniel never came at all. Meanwhile, Daniel at 32 was still living in my parents' house. He had tried and abandoned a landscaping business, a food truck venture, an e-commerce store that sold handmade candles, and a brief and expensive flirtation with cryptocurrency. He owed money to 2 friends that my father had quietly paid off. He drove a truck my father bought him and ate meals my mother cooked every single night. And still, every family dinner, every Christmas, every Easter, my parents talked about Daniel's potential like it was a promise that just had not been cashed yet. I sat across the table from that year after year. I smiled. I passed the rolls. I drove home alone and told myself it did not matter. Then my father got sick. It started as fatigue. He was 71 and we all assumed it was age, but it moved fast. Pancreatic cancer stage 4. By the time they caught it, there were maybe 6 months left, and the doctors were being generous with that number. I want to tell you that what happened next brought our family together, and maybe for a moment it did, but the cracks were already there, and grief has a way of finding every single one of them. I drove to Columbus every weekend. I sat with my father through his treatments. I learned his medication schedule. I coordinated with his palliative care team. I organized the house so my mother could manage safely. I created binders with every doctor's contact information, every medication name and dosage, every insurance form that needed to be filed. I did not do this for recognition. I want to be clear about that. I did it because he was my father and because that is who I am and because somewhere underneath all the years of being overlooked I still loved him. Daniel showed up maybe once every 3 weeks. He would stay for dinner, bring my father a magazine, sit with him for an hour and then leave. My mother treated these visits like the second coming. Claire, she would say on the phone, you should have seen how good Daniel was with your father this weekend. He really held it together. I had driven 3 hours round trip every weekend for 5 months. I said, that is wonderful, Mom. My father died on a Tuesday in March. It was early morning, still dark outside, and I was there holding his hand when he went. I had driven up the night before because something told me to go. Something in my chest said go now, so I did. My mother called Daniel and he arrived 2 hours later. He cried in a way that filled the whole room and my mother held him and the two of them leaned into each other and I stood by the window and watched. 3 days after the funeral, we sat in the office of my father's attorney, a man named Roger Hutchins, who had handled my father's affairs for over 20 years. My mother and Daniel sat on one side of the table, I sat on the other. Roger opened the folder. He said there had been a change to the will, a codicil added 11 weeks before my father's death. He said the house, the investment accounts, the real estate holdings, and the liquid assets totaling approximately $1.4 million had been left entirely to Daniel. There was a single line about me. A bequest of $5,000 described in the document as a token of love. I remember the sound the clock made on the wall of that office. I remember the pattern on the carpet. I remember my brother's hand moving to cover his mouth, and I remember thinking he is trying not to smile. Roger was still talking, but I could not hear him anymore. I looked at my mother. She looked down at the table. I drove home that afternoon on autopilot, 3 hours of highway, and I do not remember a single mile of it. I sat in my yellow kitchen and I did not cry, not yet. I just sat there and I thought about every weekend I had driven up, every medication I had organized, every night I had slept on their couch so my mother would not be alone, every time I had said it is fine when it was not fine. $5,000. A token of love. I thought about what my father must have been thinking those last weeks. Was he angry at me for something I had no idea about? Had Daniel said something? Had my mother, had the man I sat next to while he died looked at me and decided I was worth $5,000 and a line of fine print? I want to tell you I was devastated, and I was, but underneath the devastation there was something else. There was a clarity. A cold, clean, quiet kind of clarity. And I decided in that yellow kitchen on that grey March evening that I was done. Not done in a dramatic way, not done in a way that involved screaming or confrontations or Instagram posts about toxic families. Just done. Quietly, completely, permanently done. What no one in my family knew was this. For the previous 4 years I had been doing something on the side. When I was 34, a coworker of mine, a nurse named Vanessa, had introduced me to real estate investing, small stuff, at first a duplex in a working class neighborhood that I rented out, a second one 2 years later, then a small commercial unit. I had read every book, taken every course, spent every free hour I had learning a world that my father had built his life around but had never once thought to teach me. I was not rich, not even close, but I had something. I had been building a foundation. And after that day in Roger Hutchins' office I stopped being slow and careful about it. I went all in. I took the $5,000 and I put it toward a down payment on another property. I increased my nursing hours. I picked up consulting work through a healthcare staffing agency. I lived on almost nothing and I worked like I was trying to outrun something because I was. I stopped going home for holidays. My mother called. I answered briefly, warmly, without anger. She would say, "We miss you," and I would say, "I know, Mom," and I would ask about her garden and I would let the silence do the rest. Daniel texted me once to say he hoped I was doing okay. I said, "I am great, thanks." And then I went back to work. Here is what was happening on their end while I was building in silence. Daniel had inherited everything, but Daniel was still Daniel. He held the real estate portfolio for 14 months before he started liquidating it piece by piece, not to invest but to spend. My father's carefully assembled holdings, which had been generating steady rental income for decades, were sold off property by property to fund Daniel's next idea, which was a bar and music venue in downtown Columbus. My mother co-signed a business loan. The bar struggled from the first month. Daniel hired the wrong manager, overspent on renovations, booked bands that drew no crowds, and had no idea how to run the day-to-day operations because he had never run anything in his life. My Aunt Sandra, who is my father's sister and the only person in that family who ever looked at me like I was a full human being, called me about 18 months after the will was read. She said, "Claire, I think you should know what is happening over there." I said I had heard some things. She said, "It is worse than you think." She told me that Daniel had already burned through a significant portion of the inheritance, that my mother had taken out a reverse mortgage on the family home to support the bar, and that Daniel had recently had a falling out with my mother over money and had moved out and was now rarely returning her calls. I thanked Sandra, and I sat with that information for a long time. I did not feel the satisfaction I thought I would. I felt something sadder than that. I felt like I was watching a storm I had seen coming for 30 years finally make landfall, and the only person still standing in the field was my mother. My mother called me on a Sunday in October. It was the first time in almost 2 years that she had called without me picking up after the second ring. This time I let it ring 4 times before I answered. She sounded smaller than I remembered. She said, "Claire, I need to talk to you." I said, "Okay, Mom." She said, "Things have not gone well." I said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your brother is struggling, and I think I made some mistakes, and I just want you to know that I see that now." I held the phone and I breathed carefully. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." She said, "I know we were not always fair to you, and I know you know that, and I want you to come home. And here is what I want you to understand about that moment." I was not cold, I was not vindictive, I did not have a list of grievances I had been waiting to read aloud. But I also was not the same woman who had driven 3 hours every weekend and smiled across every holiday table and swallowed every slight with a nod and a "that is nice, honey." I said, "Mom, I love you and I will always be here. If you need something real, something medical, something logistical, something important, you call me and I will come." She said, "But..." I said, "But I am not coming back to the same dynamic. We cannot go back to the way things were and pretend it was fine, because it was not fine, and I think you know that." She cried a little. I let her. Then I said, "I have to go, but call me this week and we will talk more, okay?" I hung up and I sat in a silence that felt like the first clean air I had breathed in years. By the time I was 39, my real estate portfolio included 11 units across 3 properties. I had paid off my house, I had savings, I was not yet what most people would call wealthy, but I was free in a way that money only partially explains. The real freedom was the one I had built in my own mind. The understanding that I did not need to be chosen by my family to be worth something. That the woman who drove those dark highways every weekend, who organized those binders, who sat in that yellow kitchen and decided to rebuild from a token of love, was worth more than any inheritance could have measured. My brother's bar closed after 2.5 years. He lost the money he had borrowed from the business loan my mother had co-signed, and she was responsible for a portion of the debt. Her reverse mortgage had already stripped the equity from the house she had lived in for 40 years. Daniel moved in with a girlfriend and largely disappeared from the day-to-day of my mother's life. My mother called me more often now. Sometimes I drove up to see her. It was not the warm reunion that movies would have you believe happens in these moments. It was quiet and a little awkward, and sometimes we talked about the garden, and sometimes we watched television, and sometimes she would say something that told me she still did not fully understand what had happened or what she had done. But she was 74 and she was alone, and she was my mother. So I came. Not out of obligation, not out of a need to be seen or acknowledged, not waiting for an apology that would finally make everything even. I came because I had become a woman who made choices from her own values, not from her wounds. And that was the inheritance I had given myself. Sandra called me about a year after I reconnected with my mother. She said, "Claire, do you know what your father told me the week before he died?" I said no. She said he told me he changed the will because Daniel needed it more. She paused and then she said, "He told me he knew you would be fine." I held the phone and I looked out the window of my house at the street I had bought and paid for with my own labor. I said, "Yes, Sandra, I think he was right about that." She laughed a little, and so did I. And I sat with that for a long time. Not with bitterness. With something more complicated than that. My father, in his limited way, had paid me the only compliment he ever knew how to give me. He had looked at his 2 children and seen which one could survive without him. He was not wrong. I just wish he had told me. I wish just once he had looked across one of those dinner tables and said, "Claire, I see what you are, I see how hard you work, I see who you are becoming, and I want you to know that I am proud of you." He never did. And I had to learn how to live in a world where that sentence was never going to come. That is the thing about waiting for someone to finally see you. You can wait your whole life, and the tragedy is not that they never look, it is that while you are waiting you forget to look at yourself. I stopped waiting a long time ago. I am 42 now. My portfolio is 17 units. I am in the process of acquiring a small commercial property 3 blocks from the hospital where I still work 2 days a week because I love nursing. I love it in a way that has nothing to do with money or survival, and I am not willing to give it up just because I no longer need it to pay my bills. I have a life that is genuinely mine. I have a small circle of people who know exactly who I am and love that person. I have a house with a yellow kitchen and a backyard where I grow tomatoes every summer, badly but enthusiastically. Daniel reached out to me last spring. A long message. He apologized. He said he had not understood what had happened in that family. He said he had spent years thinking everything was fine and normal, and he had only recently begun to see what that environment had really been. He said he was in therapy. He said he thought about me a lot and he was sorry. I read it twice. I believed him. I wrote back 1 paragraph. I said I appreciated his honesty. I said I was doing well. I said I hoped he was finding his way and that I genuinely meant that. I did not open a door. But I did not close one either. There are people in your life who harmed you without meaning to, without even knowing, and the grace of that is complicated. It does not mean what they did was acceptable. It does not mean you owe them a relationship. It just means that people are broken in ways that start long before you arrive, and that understanding someone's brokenness does not require you to let it keep touching yours. My mother is 75 and her health is beginning to slow. I help her when she needs it. Practically, I manage her medications. I drove her to her cardiology appointment last month and sat in that waiting room and filled out her paperwork. She looked at me in the car on the way home. She said, "I do not know what I would do without you." I kept my eyes on the road. I said, "You are not going to have to find out." She reached over and put her hand on mine for a moment. She did not say I am sorry. She did not say I was wrong about everything. She just left her hand there for 3 seconds on the highway and then she put it back in her lap. And that was enough. Not because I did not deserve more, but because I had stopped measuring my worth in what other people were able to give me. The woman who sat in Roger Hutchins' office and heard about a token of love is not the woman sitting in this car right now. That woman was surviving. This woman is living. And the difference between those two things is the only inheritance that ever mattered. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this story, I want you to hear this. You do not need them to finally see you before you can begin. You do not need the apology to heal. You do not need to wait for the karma to arrive before you give yourself permission to be okay. The work you do in the dark, when no one is watching, when no one is handing you anything, when you are eating canned soup in a small apartment, paying down a debt that feels infinite and wondering if any of it is worth it. That work is the story. The inheritance was never in the will. It was in every single choice you made when it would have been so much easier not to.